So it's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome you to Princeton and this workshop that my colleagues in the Near Eastern Studies Department have organized. I hope you've had a chance to go out and enjoy the weather as well, but I'm sure what's happening indoors is much more interesting and exciting for you. So I was asked to speak about Muslim Americans, and so what I did is try to put some data together on the status of Muslim Americans since 9/11. I mean, I don't think before 9/11 people talked about Muslim Americans to the extent or the degree that they discuss them today. Nevertheless, if you think about Islam in America is not a new phenomenon. You can trace the existence of Islam in the U.S. way back to the late 1700s, early 1800s even. But with the 20th century, with the policies on immigration relaxing in the 1960s, you had an influx of immigrants from the Muslim world come to the United States. The Muslim American population is not a monolithic population. People often synonymously treat Muslims and Arabs. The truth is, not all Muslims are Arab and not all Arabs are Muslim. In fact, what percentage of Muslims do you think are Arab? Okay, somebody seems to know.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I know that the Arab American population, I think it's about 70% Christian, I think.
So among the Arab American population, you have about 65% of the Arab American population is Christian, and about 35 to 40% is Muslim. So the majority is Christian, and among the Muslim population, what percentage is Arab?
20%. You mean the whole world? You mean worldwide?
No,
Here in the United States.
maybe 20 or 30%.
Close to 25%, only a quarter of the population, the Muslim population is of Arab descent. So 75% of the Muslim population is of different nationalities. What's the largest segment of the Muslim American population?
South Asian.
South Asian, okay.
Filipino? No.
Is it white?
African American.
African American. So about 40 to 50% of the Muslim American population is African American, is indigenous American. And then another 50% is Arab, South Asian, European, African. Outside of the U.S., outside the African American community, you can trace the Muslim population in America to 81 different nationalities worldwide. It's the most diverse and heterogeneous population in the world. And that's because the Muslim world is also very varied, right? Yes?
How many Muslims are there in the United States?
Okay, that's a very good question. And the reason why I laugh is that it becomes a very heated debate. Because our census does not track religious groups, it's basically very difficult to get a precise count. So the Muslim American community and leaders of the Muslim American community place their numbers at about 12 to 14 million people. Demographers who use very conservative estimates say the Muslim population is no more than 5 million. So you can see there's a huge difference. And this matters a lot in terms of how you sell those numbers, especially in swing states, right? Come the election, Ohio, Florida, California, Michigan, the Muslim population becomes all the more salient in terms of figuring out to what extent they can swing some of these votes in certain levels. So it's a heated debate. I would say, people have often asked where I would put the population. I think the fair estimate, especially if you think about the percentage of children Muslim American families tend to have, they outpace the average population. I think I'd feel more comfortable putting the number close to 8 to 9 million in terms of what I've seen. I don't think it's really at 14 million, but I also don't think it's at 3 to 4 million either.
With the African American statistic, how much of that is Nation of Islam as opposed to
Traditional.
mainstream?
Long-term, like traditional
Yes.
family.
So a lot of the African American Muslim presence is influenced by the Nation of Islam, although the Nation of Islam itself within the African American Muslim community has dwindled. But nevertheless, you still see the influence. So it's not as it's still a well-organized community within the African American Muslim population, but it's much more of a smaller branch. A lot of the the new African American convert population. So there's a very large convert population. It's very much Sunni Islam, and very much influenced by the teachings of Sunni Islam, from Wahhabism or just from traditional Sunni texts.
Of the ones that are not, of the 50% of Muslims that are not African Americans, how does it break down? Like from India, where does it break down? For Indonesia, where are the rest of them if they're not native African American?
So about 40% is African American,
Yeah.
right? So I'd say about 25% of the Muslim population is about Arab Muslim. Another 30% is about, 30 to 35% is about Asian Muslim. Now Asian Muslim is a huge category. You have the Pakistanis, the Indians, Indonesians, Bangladesh, all across Asia. So that altogether there is about, about almost 95% of the Muslim American population. Then 5% is other. You have a lot of white European Muslims. You have a lot of, maybe less than 1% Latino Muslims. So it's a huge diverse population in that nature, in that regard, yeah. Well, and then also said basically, so for all the talk about there being Islam in America, or a monolithic Islam in America, or a unified voice of the Muslim community, you can just imagine right now that there's nothing further from the truth. And because Islam is such a decentralized religion and a decentralized faith, it's not clear who speaks on behalf of the Muslim community. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because as an American myself, you look at the mosque landscape in the United States, it's also very much divided along ethnic lines. So you'll have your Arab mosque, your Asian mosque, your African American mosque. You have a few mosques that are mixed, but I would say 90% of the mosques are ethnically based, which basically tells you that what happens in one mosque does not reflect whatever happens in another mosque. And many times if those two mosques are in the same community, the likelihood is that they're competing for members and resources from the same Muslim community. So there's a lot of this inter-Muslim dynamics going on.
An interesting comparison even to sort of earlier European immigration here with Catholicism. You had your Polish church, your Italian church, your Irish church, and no one ever went to the other. They just
and if people intermarried in their own ethnic communities,
exactly.
but nevertheless there was a Catholic issue.
Exactly.
Right, exactly.
So how does that impact pretty much inter-Muslim relations in the country?
So before 9/11, it was just everybody was basically doing their own thing. I think after 9/11, there grew a growing consensus. So remember, also 9/11 also corresponds to a moment in Muslim American integration and assimilation and incorporation. Muslims really started populating the U.S. in the 1960s. So now by 9/11, you have a second generation of Muslims growing up in the United States who are basically American. And you tell an American Muslim we're only going to go to the Pakistani mosque, we're only going to go to the Arab mosque, or we're only going to speak the language, the language of our homeland, and the only homeland they know is the U.S., it's just not going to bode well. So with 9/11, with the second generation, you've seen a lot more of this cross-coalitional formation. And it's really funny, so I was telling me, if you look at, so one of the largest groups that unites Muslims in the United States is ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. If you look at their conference programs each year since the 1980s, so in the 1980s, their conference program would be how to live in the United States as Muslims. Clearly there's the United States and you are not part of the United States. Don't compromise your values to be America, right? So in the 80s, there was us versus them, beware, take care, blah, 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 blah. By the 2000s, how to be a good Muslim American, asserting your right to be American, asserting your right to be part of the landscape and part of the country. So it also reflects these generational changes, these generational shifts as well. And with the generational shifts, you see a lot more of the cross-coalition. So for example, right now, if you look on our campus, we have the Muslim Student Association. I don't think anybody asks anybody about what their ethnic background is, right? So there's just a Muslim Student Association.
I know that ISIS has been trying to target certain young people at mosques throughout the United States. Are they going to the Arab mosques more than, or are they targeting all mosques, or how are they, given that all the ethnicities are concentrated mosque by mosque,
Right.
who are they going after?
So that's a really good question, and it's part of my presentation, but I'll just jump into it, and then I can fly through my presentation, actually. I think it's far more interesting than my presentation. So the interesting thing, so I, as a consumer of Fox News myself, for better or worse, I do it for research purposes. She says. The recruitment of Muslim youth from the United States for ISIS is still at a bare minimum. I mean, especially if you compare what's happening in the US to Europe, our numbers are just like, it's like fewer than 100 individuals have actually been targeted and recruited into ISIS from the United States. So the interesting research question is why do you have over like 5,000 to 6,000 now substantiated cases from Europe and so few from the United States?
Yeah.
And the truth is that the Muslim story in America is completely different than the Muslim story in Europe, right? So you look at, and this is part of my presentation, but you look at the Muslim story in America, if you look at assimilation indicators, socioeconomic indicators, percent of Muslim population who is educated, the per capita income of the Muslim population, what jobs they occupy, where they have influence in the United States, on average, the Muslim American family is doing just as well as the non-Muslim American family, if not slightly even better on income, overall income, right? So for all, I mean, I say this, for all, everything we scream and shout about Islamophobia and Fox News and all of that, it hasn't hurt the Muslim American family in terms of being able to succeed and rise on the social mobility ladder in this country. If you look at the Muslim European story, the average Muslim family, whether in France or Germany or the UK, and the UK, remember, you have this big Asian professional segment of the population in Europe that constitute doctors and whatnot, but even then, especially if you look at France and Germany, the average Muslim family is earning about 15 to 20 percentage points lower than the average non-Muslim European family, right? So if you're Muslim in Europe, guess what? You're going to be Muslim in Europe for a very long time. If you're born in the ghetto, you're going to stay in the ghetto. If you're born in those like depressed suburbs, you're going to stay in those depressed suburbs. And there's much more, quote unquote, of a cultural divide there, right? Where Europeans really do look down on their Muslim counterparts because of the nature of both the socioeconomic nature, but I also believe increasingly there's a cultural divide. I think the US is far more hospitable to religious diversity and religious groups because this is a religious country. I mean, if you look at how, the percentage of people in this country who believe in God is just as high as the percentage of people who believe in God all across the developing world, like above 80, 90%. In Europe, it's not even close. So because of that, because there's a tradition of tolerating different religious faiths and religious freedoms and whatnot, I think Muslims have done really well in this country. That's not the story in Europe. So to get back to your question really quickly, who is ISIS targeting in the US?
Even worldwide, you don't have to stick in the United States.
Well, worldwide. ISIS is very clever, right? ISIS is targeting people, right, who have ambition, have expectations, they, want to be successful. They probably have too much testosterone, right? So they're targeting those young men, right? Young men. They're using if you look at their recruitment material, they're using these very elaborate, interesting Xbox / like PlayStation video game type recruitment material. So it's like cool, you can have a gun. We'll probably give you a couple of wives, don't worry about it. And they're targeting people who don't have anything else to do, right? Yeah. So if you're a young guy sitting around in Jordan or in Egypt or in Minneapolis, right? In Minnesota, and I'll talk about that, and you don't have a job, you're already unemployed, the likelihood of you getting a job is not very high. You're looking at joining a gang in the US or joining a gang in Europe. So if you look at the religious profiles of these individuals, right, a lot of these individuals have backgrounds of having been involved in gangs, having been involved with drugs, having had some kind of alterations with law enforcement. And then also ISIS comes along and says, we're going to give you $1,000 a month. We'll give you an iPhone, we'll give you a computer, a couple of wives, right, because they rotate. Right, no, and you don't have to worry about your parents. We'll take care of you, we'll give you a gun and, fight the good fight, and you might end up in heaven. They're on their way. They're looking at how to cross the border into Turkey. And so that's the problem. So what's happening in Minnesota, what they're finding out is that there's a segment of Muslim blacks from Somalia, like first-generation immigrants who are struggling to find jobs struggling to get, so everybody says, oh, what is it about Somali Islam? It's not about Somali Islam. It's about that you have to think about what it means to be an African immigrant in the US, coming from a very poor country, going into a very poor community that is rather kind of, enclaved. What does that mean for creating a psychology that allows something like ISIS to be attractive? It's the same story. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was saying, it's the same story about why, let's say, blacks or people join gangs in Chicago, in the inner cities, right? Why do people end up, hustling, bustling, carrying guns? It gives them a sense of purpose, a meaning, they have a gun, they're powerful now, nobody wants to threaten them, they get money on the side. And so it's that common kind of ilk.
Can I ask one more question? Is the socioeconomic status of those that come to America and those that go to the UK the same when they start out? Or are the Muslims that come to the United States better educated when they just arrive, so they have a better chance of success versus the ones that are coming from the colonies? And is also the colony, we don't have the same colonial prejudices that, like
That the Europeans have.
Europeans do, that you're from the colony. So is that in play also?
So all of that is in play. But the truth is still, an immigrant who comes to this country with the same socioeconomic background to this country versus Europe has a higher chance of success in this country.
Even if they're starting
All things equal. Having said that, Europe is deliberately targeting a sector of labor to man their economy. At some point in Europe, people stopped having children, right? So the average German family is having like 0.8 children, right? So somebody needs to man those economies. So they said, we'll import the labor. So they started importing the labor, especially from North African countries, and then the labor has to stay, and they need to integrate and assimilate. And that's what Europe was not really prepared for. This is a bigger problem in Europe altogether.
But I think it's the second generation of those immigrants who, okay, the parents have assimilated, they become part of society, they want their children to be successful, but somewhere there's a disconnect between the expectations of the parents versus what society's giving them.
Right.
And then that crisis of identity is not leading them up to be recruited by groups from the ISIS and things like that.
That's right on target, but it's not only a crisis of identity, it's a crisis of now I am a European, and you'll see this in my presentation, hopefully. I am a European, or I am an American, and I have lived now in this country through 3 generations, and my parents have paid taxes. I'm just similar to the person next door. Why am I being disadvantaged for my cultural background? That's not right. That's what creates a lot of resentment and anxiety, and you see that the 2nd and 3rd generation are far more likely to stand up, either in healthy ways, or as we're seeing right now, in very unhealthy and scary ways. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to fly through some of this. Okay, so some of the advances, and you guys feel free to stop me, so I've mentioned some of this already. So some of the advancements in the Muslim American community in 2015 is that you have a younger generation, especially of non-Muslim Americans. The younger generation, the younger generation of Americans is far more favorable towards Muslims in their outlook than, let's say, the generation before. And I believe this becomes, one of the ironies that came after 9/11 is that with the increasing levels of Islamophobia, is that there was still a commitment to understand and learn from one another. Like even what we're doing here, like there was, you think about churches and synagogues and mosques and interfaith dialogue, and this idea of reaching out and getting to know one another. It's really happened all across a lot of American segments of the society. Muslims continue to advance in all professions and are doing quite well socioeconomically in this country as well. Some of the setbacks recently is what we were just talking about, the threat of ISIS. It's over-exaggerated, but it's real. And so we need to keep our eye on it. And so the incident like in North Carolina where the 3 students, one guy killed the 3 students, and the way that played out in the media. So whether or not it was a hate crime or not, and whether or not the whole overwhelming environment of Islamophobia sort of allowed such a crime to occur, and it's still not clear whether it's going to be labeled a hate crime or not. Some of the consequences since 9/11, and so we still see in the public, Muslim Americans are still battling the public opinion in this country. When Americans are asked whether or not Muslims should be profiled in airports, you see that about a good majority of the population, among the Muslim population, all Muslims expect to be searched and profiled in airports. 43% of Americans say they are prejudiced against Muslims still, and by 3 to 1, those polled favor the idea of subjecting airline passengers to more intensive security checks if they fit a profile of a terrorist, which means Muslim American, based on age, ethnicity, and gender. So there's still some subtle support, not even subtle, like, major support for some of these findings.
How much of this is based on actual understanding of Islam? I mean, I have students who are of Sikh background, and they're consistently telling about how they're targeted as Muslim.
Right.
Indeed, if I remember correctly, the first person who suffered
After 9/11 was a Sikh. Yeah.
a person of Sikh background.
Yeah, and so you'll see that the problem is that in public opinion polls, so this is like in my concluding slide, is that the good news is that, but we'll just, since we're jumping all over the place, is that if you know a Muslim or you know what the Quran is, you're far more likely to have favorable opinions of Muslim and Islam. So it's clearly the knowledge gap in this country. The fact that people don't know much about Islam, they don't know much about Muslims, they've never seen or encountered Muslims. So there is this not knowing. On top of that, there is still, you'll see this, there is still this sort of like hyper alarmist discourse that emanates from some segments of the population, like the media, like Fox News, sometimes CNN, especially even from our government officials, right? That irresponsibly cast the entire Muslim population or the entire Muslim American population as complicit in terrorism, or the fact that Muslim Americans still might know something about terrorism, but they're just not sharing it because they're not really American. And so this is something that's been played out over and over in the media and in the community. And so if you know Muslims, right, you tend to have like barbecues on Sundays with your Muslim neighbors, you're like, this is just not right. But if you don't know Muslims and you live somewhere where there's like 3 Muslims in the entire state, like let's say Wyoming, where they were passing an anti-Sharia campaign because Sharia was taking over Wyoming, right? then it's a reason to believe, well, yeah, the Muslims are taking over the entire country or something, in a weird way. But so we're going to show this in just a bit.
Well, you just said that most Arabs in this country are not Muslim. So, and there's nothing in your passport that says that your religious affiliation. So when you say if you're Muslim, is it if you're Arab or if you're foreign? What is the
So it's really funny. So the truth
if
is,
you're an African American, are you
if you're brown looking with any name that is not like Hudson,
That's where
right? Like anything like that, like Khan or like any version of Muhammad Ahmad Said or something like that. Like the likelihood is that you're gonna get pulled
But
over.
what about African Americans? You said that 50% of all Muslims in this country are African American. They could be John Brown or Joseph.
Right.
So are they're not profiled?
They're not profiled, but like African Americans are profiled. They've already been profiled. I mean, that's like, so like, I mean, the worst combination here is like the African American Muslim if they know you're Muslim and black, right? I mean,
What happened if you're Christian and you're Arab? Are Christians, are they I'm just
Yes, some
thinking.
people-
So Christian Arabs, and that's why there's a lot of resentment sometimes among the Christian Arab population, is that, look, we're Christians, we were already persecuted by the Muslims in some of these countries, and now we have to pay the price for this, like, we're not doing it. And actually after 9/11, you had a lot of churches, let's say in Dearborn, where you have a large Arab population, who came out and said, we are not Muslims, otherwise, it was really sad, like after 9/11, because these churches and mosques, they used to get together and do joint activities, but because there was so much threat, they came out with statements like, we have nothing to do with that mosque across the street, like, and it took a long time for the community to heal after that. Yeah.
But it's not, so
I think there was a Maronite church that took out a whole ad in the Dearborn paper to say, you know what, we never even wanted to be Arab.
But it's just interesting that the profiling is all off base. I mean, they're profiling the wrong, I mean, it's not even connected in any way to what they're really,
And that's the whole problem, right? I mean, so when you think about profiling, and you think how they're like limiting the profile, it's concerning not because only you're discriminating against like people who look like me. It's concerning because if you want to do something bad and you know that they're just profiling on ethnicity, it's very easy to jump the profile, to skip the
Right.
profile.
Right.
So there's no, and you'll see this, there's no substitute for good intelligence, right?
I should also add too, there's always going to be a lapse, there's always going to be a mistake. I know that the town where I used to live in New York, there was an attack against an Indian restaurant in response to 9/11 because they said, oh, those people attack our country, not realize that the owner of the place was a Christian. And similarly, a few months after 9/11, when you had the shoe bomber, whose name was Richard Reed, a very Anglo-sounding name, and I remember the press conference right after, they said he appears to be of Middle Eastern descent, when in reality he was a biracial product of a British mother and a Jamaican father who just converted to Islam at some point later in life. But again, he was totally not Middle Eastern, completely not of Arab descent, and had an English-sounding name, which was all legitimate. And you never know. I mean, people will make mistakes many times. People will profile in one case but not in another case. It's
No, that's right. I mean, there's no substitute for good intelligence, and a lot of these security, like, so for example, when the Boston Marathon bombings happened, right? I mean, these are people that were being, the older brother was being monitored by intelligence, and they did nothing. And the truth is, it's in the Muslim community, this is where we think there are huge failures and disappointments, because look, it's no secret in the Muslim American community that almost everybody believes or knows, and it's probably true, that your cell phone, your internet, your mail, your correspondence, all being monitored. So in a way, that's fine if you're creating a safer America. I mean, I'm not saying it's fine. I know there's, I'm not saying it's fine. I'm saying, okay, if it's gonna be fine, at least make this country safer. But if you're not doing your job and catching these people running around with like bombs and like steam cookers or whatever it is, and making it worse for everybody, then it's not okay. Then you're like, monitoring me and my daughters, what we shop on and buy on the internet, and not catch this. I mean, so that's even like there's a disappointment on that end. So that's why there's no substitute for good intelligence.
Do you think that the profile is effective at all? In other words, we wait in lines and it actually sounds like the whole thing is just a waste of everybody's time.
So there was an excellent study by Charles Kurzman recently, who basically said all the profiling of everything we do, how many terrorists, real terrorists, that have we actually caught in the United States because of that? In the last 15 years, I think it was like 2 people.
And you think of the millions and millions and millions.
I mean, think about all of that, and somebody just said even all the stuff that we're subjected to in the airport is, and the money.
Yes, you're right.
But everything we're subjected to in the airport is just for psychological benefit, to make you, me, all of us feel more relaxed about traveling. I mean, that's what I saw a study about that because you literally, and I'm not gonna try it, but if you guys who think you can pass the profile, it's very common to sneak things onto these planes.
I've done
I mean, I'm not, I'm gonna make sure I'm being videotaped. Please don't do it. Okay? I was just saying, this is what I understand, okay. So, where racism is no longer tolerated in the US, at least we'd like to think so, right? And there's especially if you're, what happens in police trucks, well, people being escorted, but, anti-Muslim rhetoric is acceptable and in fact seen as a measure of US patriotism, right? So the way the Fox News sometimes trumpets this is that if you're patriotic, if you're nationalistic, if you're American loving, then you really can't tolerate Muslims. What's really interesting is that me and my colleagues, we did a study on social desirability bias. And social desirability bias is basically, the idea is that, you could be a racist, but in this day and age, we know better. Even if you're a racist, you don't go out and say, hey, damn it, I'm a racist, right? Or I really hate those people, or I want to go after those people, because it's just not tolerated. So the study that we did, we were able to show that people were willing to conceal their true feelings about other minority groups or ethnic groups only when it came to Muslim Americans. There were no pressures for social desirability bias. There were no pressures. So if you're anti-Muslim and you're sitting in a bar and you can say, I hate all those Muslims, you're fine with it because nobody's going to sanction you. So Muslims are exempt from the social desirability pressures.
Did you guys publish that anywhere?
We are, it's forthcoming article.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which
Journal,
Yeah,
it's
journal.
forthcoming social science research, yeah.
It's like a little plug.
And for all the talk about Obama being a Muslim, and probably because Obama has been accused of being a Muslim, there's been very little public defense on behalf of Muslims from President Obama. I mean, the Muslim community was very enthusiastic about electing him, I think after the African American community. So 94% of the African American community voted for Obama. 89%, again, this is 89% of the Muslim American community, again, a community that doesn't unite easily, voted for Obama too. It was really funny, this is neither here nor there, but at the national press,
Oh, so, yeah,
did you see that? Where Obama was saying, like, his life is very busy these days, and one of the things he said, well, you know, I have to pray 5 times a day. So he's just joking about it. Anyways,
could you go back to that slide just for a second, because I missed the second, the 86%.
right here.
Obama's a little, okay, he's.
Oh, okay, yeah, so, okay. So, by and large, Muslims are very politically engaged in the country. 86% of Muslims say it's important for them to participate in the political process in the United States. About 25% are involved in political parties. Traditionally, the Muslim American involvement has been divided equally between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, because the Muslim community tends to be more socially conservative and tends to be, especially among the wealthier segments of the population, they veer towards the Republicans. On the other hand, in recent years, because of the Islamophobia, you've seen a lot of Muslims vote Democratic. 73% of the American Muslims are registered to vote. 63% are active in sports and youth programs. 75% have participated in organization that helps the poor or elderly in the country. Let me just move forward because a lot of this are things that we said. Okay, so what's the type of environment or the policies that have affected the Muslim American community? We all know initially there was Patriot Acts 1 and 2, which had singled out Arab and Muslim Americans. The National Security Entry and Exit Registry also came very close to singling out only Muslim and Arab Americans. And Ashcroft, right after the 9/11, removed more Arabs and Muslims from the U.S. than the number of foreign nationals deported during the infamous Palmer raids of 1919. So a lot of Muslims and Arabs just loved the country. A lot of them ended up in Canada at the time. In October 2005, the U.S. Senate Intelligence Community approved the Pentagon's request to covertly collect information on U.S. citizens to see whether they are suitable for potential recruitment. The new legislation targeted Muslims whom the government believes have crucial information in the fight against terror as it's linked to Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, so there's always this unsubstantiated claim that the Muslim American community has knowledge about terrorists who are operating in Iraq and Afghanistan. I bet, and I don't say this in a bad way or in a disparaging way, if you took a map to the majority of Muslim Americans and asked them to tell you where Afghanistan and Iraq were, they would probably get that wrong.
When you say Muslims, are these Arab Muslims, or these African American Muslims? Who are they?
All Muslims. So the United States has now more or less mapped out where all the Muslim population lives. And how have they done that? They've gone where you have mosques. So this is what I've learned in doing my research. Where there are mosques, they've mapped out a 1 mile radius because they figure that 90% of the Muslim population lives within a mile radius of a mosque. But see, that's not, you know, if you believe that only 50% of the Muslim population is observant, then there's another 50% that are not. So basically, you're profiling Muslims who go to the mosque, right? So number one, if you're a Muslim who wants to do something bad, well, if you want to do something bad, don't be a Muslim. But if you are a Muslim and want to be something bad, don't participate in the mosque, right? Stay out of the mosque. So the mosques are being profiled.
But
If
all ethnic mosques.
all ethnic mosques.
Okay.
If apparently, so somebody also told me your credit cards are being monitored. So if you shop at places that are not your typical, you guys are all from New Jersey, right?
Some New York.
Well, okay, ShopRite,
Yeah.
Stop and Shop.
Yeah.
If all of a sudden you shop at, you know, halal kebab or halal meat, right? So all halal restaurants will trigger also a profile. I mean, there's like a database, an algorithm, right? Oh, I love algorithms. Algorithms, and one of the factors in the algorithm is, are you shopping at these ethnic places that serve halal meats? Or, so like in New York now, it's so funny, because in New York now, you have all these halal carts. And they did a poll of New Yorkers, and they said, like, you know, why do you buy halal, like, you know, halal food from the vendors? And people in New York think of halal just like they think of it as Tex-Mex or like some kind of like interesting cuisine. Like nobody understands that these are like, you know, selling like halal meat that's butchered in a certain way. So I'm wondering if so my question was like, well, all these New Yorkers who are buying from the halal carts, are they now on the profile? And they're like, yeah. So like they're being picked up in the algorithm now.
So much of that's cash, so they would know the cash.
Well, yeah, but like, let's say you use a credit card.
Yeah, but right.
Yeah, let's say you use a credit card, or let's say you go to, so let's say I went to an Islamic, I want to buy my hijabs, and you can't buy hijabs at like the mall, you go online and buy them. That is going to trigger a profile too. So this information is available, collected, and being processed. So the purported connection between U.S. Muslims and terrorists in the Muslim world continues to be a major factor shaping U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Muslim community. So what are some of the statements? I'll just read these. So in 2003, Representative King declared that the vast majority of American Muslim leaders are enemies living amongst us. He then further added that he would say that 80 to 85% of mosques in the U.S. are run by Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, that's an overarching statement to say that 80 to 85% of mosques are run by Islamic fundamentalists. Governor Mitch Romney of Massachusetts at the time, before he ran for president, raised the prospects of wiretapping U.S. mosques in order to prevent terrorist attacks from occurring. And so again, the idea that you have to link between mosques and terrorism. Furthermore, in September of 2015, it was disclosed that American mosques were being monitored by the U.S. government for radiation. Now, here's the funny part. Most U.S. mosques are linked to Islamic school, like, you know, Islamic day schools for children. So, like, the idea is that Muslims are housing radiation in their mosques where their children are going to school. Right? I mean, so this is, so it's like this far-fetched, like, you know, the Muslim population is so beyond rational, capably being rational and loving of their own children, that they would actually, first of all, they actually know where to find radiation. I don't even know how to store radiation. And then you put it in your mosques, because as if the mosque, right, because, I mean, you gotta be really stupid, first of all, if you're a Muslim of today's age, to think that you can hide anything in the mosque and think it won't be disclosed, right?
Are people in the mosque aware? That you're aware, does the average person going to the mosque, are they aware that they're being, you know, targeted in this way and that their credit cards are being looked at? Are they?
I don't think the level of credit card detail and all that, because then also like look at like also because a lot of Muslims come, especially the immigrants, come from countries where they were already repressed under authoritarian rule. I think this would create an unhealthy level of paranoia. But there is a level of paranoia in the community right now. If you go to the mosque, right, and it's very common, like you'll be at the mosque and you know, you go to your same mosque normally for 5-6 years, all of a sudden out of the blue you meet these people that come to your mosque with like long beards and like, you know, wow, they're so excited and they want to do great things, and everybody's like, oh no, that's a government informant. like, you know, every month or so a government informant is sent into the mosque, right? And so at that point people say like, you know, if you're a real Muslim, welcome. If you're a government informant, by all means search the mosque to make sure everything is clear, right? But there is that level of paranoia.
Do they know it to the level that you know it, right?
No, I don't think I don't think if people knew that everything you bought was being monitored, people would probably stop using their credit cards, but...
It's being monitored by everybody for...
Right, I think everybody's being monitored, yeah.
Have there been any, like, overly, like, covert police operations in different mosques?
Well, the NYPD scandal, right?
Yeah.
Right, the one that reached like 2 years ago?
Yeah, Northern Jersey. Like,
Northern Jersey, so they were basically staking out Muslim restaurants,
Right.
Muslim grocery stores, Muslim
Yeah.
mosques. They were trying to recruit informants. I mean, it was a clear violation of all civil and political liberties. And I think what the mayor's office had to apologize and
And New Jersey itself.
And New Jersey
Yes,
itself.
Jersey was angry at New
Of
York,
course,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, no, it was an embarrassing scandal. I mean, because it was just like reaching into the community. And there have been many cases also, unfortunately, of entrapment, right? Where you sort of find a dispossessed person or kind of like clearly a youth who's being challenged by his identity or trying to figure things out, or maybe he's having problems at home. And then basically somebody goes up to him and says, we'll give you money, we'll give you a gun, will you do this? And then if he agrees to, well, then he's arrested because he was a terrorist. But the truth is, that person will not have had any connections with any outside terrorist group, right? And so on the one hand, you'd say, like, is this really, like, if you went to probably any other community and you found disaffected youth, and you targeted them in this way, would they also be susceptible? So this is where it's not clear about what's going on. So hate crimes have been on the rise. And this is a chart I show often because for me it's the one that makes me sad. Is that at the eve of 9/11, when people said, how different is your religion from Christianity? How different do you think Islam is from your religion? And here, at the eve of 9/11, 52% said Islam and Christianity, or Islam and my religion, are very different. And 31% said they're the same. They're Judeo-Abrahamic faith, so they're quite similar. By 2007, 70% said they are very different, and only 19% say they're the same. So that since 9/11, with all the opportunities to know one another and learn from one another and understand one another, we see that the separation has only increased.
How about now?
Yeah.
I would say now is probably quite similar, if not more. I think what's not helped Muslims is the Republican launch against Islam and Obama, by trying to cast Obama as being really not an American national, not patriotic. I mean, there's just, that he's serving some other purpose in the world. That hasn't helped. And then there have been campaigns. So right before the 2012 elections, what's his name? The rich guy, Adelson? No?
Yeah.
Sheldon.
Sheldon Adelson. He basically supported and sponsored the DVDs about Islam in America and the growing Muslim community basically going to, and they spread these DVDs, like I think over 300,000 to 400,000 households in the South. And so this was a propaganda campaign that was just, designed to foment more hatred, more misunderstanding, more distrust between Americans and Muslims. Yeah.
Just a quick question, I don't know if
Please.
you know this or not. The age range for the questions or for this poll that was being asked?
Yeah.
This is the entire population. The younger generation you're not going to find this in the younger generation.
Well, because I've been teaching high school and I still have students that don't know that Catholicism and Christianity are similar. So as far as just general religious ignorance,
Right.
there's a whole lot of that that goes
Yeah,
around
no,
with
I
younger
hear you.
students.
Do you know which organization came up with this?
Pew Research Center, yeah. And Pew Research Center has two studies on Muslim American attitudes, 2007 and 2011, and you can find them online. Okay, well, okay, so 37%, this is based on the 2007 study, 37% of the Muslim population worries about job security due to their faith. Although, even though that worry exists, you've had very few cases of Muslim Americans losing their jobs because of their own faith or because of their religious attire. Even when those cases you are dismissed, I mean, the most recent case I think is a woman working for one of those
In New York.
in New York, but her job was reinstated.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, so you really can't discriminate.
She was wearing a hijab.
I think she was wearing a hijab. Sometimes men have beards,
Yeah.
but those cases never hold up.
And back to my same question about when you say 30% of the Muslim population, that includes those that don't wear hijab? Does it include the African American population?
It includes all of them, all of them.
So if someone is an African American and they're Muslim, because I have some at the school that I work and they don't look at all, would they be part of that, in that study, they would be included?
They would be
in
part
that?
of the study, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but has it been broken down by, if you're an Arab Muslim wearing a hijab, do you have a higher fear
Yeah.
versus, you know, what I mean, it
Yeah,
seems like
no.
you're collapsing a lot of different visual references into one big Muslim, I mean, it seems like there are many different ways you can.
So there was, I see your point 100%.
And an Arab Christian, would they be worried about losing their job just because they look Arabic?
Or they sound
Or
Arabic.
they sound Arabic?
Probably, but probably not to the same extent. So there was an interesting study done recently by an economics professor where women had exactly the same CVs, but one woman had the hijab, and I think they were applying for jobs in New York. So there were job openings, the woman with the hijab, woman without the hijab, and consistently across the board, the woman with the hijab wasn't getting the job. And wasn't getting the type of Q&A or interaction in the interview as the non-hijab woman. And it was published. I forgot to bring that. I should have brought those slides. I have them somewhere. So I don't want to downplay that. That's certainly happening. But on average, still, you're seeing that when you've seen these cases that you can sort of put your finger on and say that that's not right, the legal system has been very supportive. Yeah. So. So when asked by the 2006 Pew Survey to identify the most important problem facing Muslims in the community, 60% of the responses were about countering stereotypes and discrimination. So, and 53% still say it's much more difficult to be Muslim after 9/11. So here's some really quick, I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, but gets us to the point about the second and third generation. So in this 2007 survey, 2006-2007 survey, they asked Muslim Americans, do you support the opinions of Al-Qaeda? And that 1% had a very favorable opinion of the Muslim American population, 4% had a favorable opinion. Now if you work on public opinion data or survey data, 5% is what you normally call in the noise, right? It's noisy data. There was a survey in 2008, I believe, that asked citizens in Baltimore, everybody, did you support the attacks on, not the World Trade Center, not 9/11, but the World Trade Center attacks that happened before that?
One of the early
Yeah.
days,
And you have about 11% say yes, and a lot of that was noise as well. So you're gonna get this random noise. But nevertheless, you had about 5% that we could say are perhaps supportive of Al-Qaeda. Do American Muslims justify suicide bombings to defend Islam? 8% of US Muslims believe they are justified, compared to 16% in France and Spain, and 15% in Bahrain. So again, Britain, yes. So comparing the European responses to the US responses. Now, what's interesting about this is that when we look at, let me show you just some data. Is that by and large, when we break down this data, it turned out that the second generation was far more likely to say they support suicide bombings, and was more likely to say, of that 5%, when you break it down, it was the second generation who said they were going to support Al-Qaeda. And so what do you make of this finding that the US-born Muslims are less satisfied, they desire separation, and are more likely to support Al-Qaeda? And I was making the argument that something has gone wrong with the assimilation script, especially with the second generation. And at one of the conferences where I was talking, there were a bunch of immigration specialists, and they came back to me and they said, no. If you look at the second generation everywhere, they are more likely to try to kind of assert and locate their identity in the country they're in, and they will adopt these sort of like extreme policy stances to prove the point. So let me try to get at that. So one possible explanation is that the US-born Muslims are likely to tolerate the backlash, are less likely to tolerate the backlash than their immigrant cohort or their immigrant parents. And it turned out that the US-born population was more likely to say that they have experienced discrimination. So this says, have you been discriminated against? No. Have you been discriminated against? Yes. You're born Muslim in the US, you immigrated. Born Muslims in the US, 41% say they have experienced discrimination, while 18% of the parents have said they've experienced discrimination. Have you not experienced discrimination? 82%, 59%. Now, there's a lot going on here. First of all, immigrants come to this country, they really want better opportunities, right? So if, I remember this, like my mom didn't speak very good English. When we would go to the store, people would say they don't understand her. I saw that as discrimination. She just saw that I don't speak English well, right? And so I was willing to register it and say, just because you don't speak English, you deserve to be treated better. So that can be what's going on, but also the second generation is more likely to be in situations, like my mom went to the grocery store, but then went and hanged out with her friends who speak Arabic, and then watched her soap operas in Arabic, and so she wasn't really in the mainstream. I'm basically, everything I do is almost in the mainstream, except when I go to mosque maybe once a week, right? So there's a difference in terms of how that happens.
Could it also have to do with the fact that the immigrants came here from countries where discrimination is not a problem? Discrimination is the way of the law of the land.
Right.
Minorities are discriminated against, they live in repressive societies, women are second class, voting is non-existent, and coming here, this is like the most free, open, least discriminatory society they've ever seen. Does that make them a lot more open and tolerant?
Well, yeah, I think there is some, in the interviews we've done with immigrants, it's basically this praise for the economic opportunities. At least I can feed my children in this country. At least a lot of Muslim immigrants will say things like, back home, if I went to the mosque 5 times a day, the government would be monitoring me and pick me up because the government thinks that people who are very observant might be linked to these Islamic movements or this opposition. Here, you can practice religion freely. So there was some of that, this comparison.
Would it also be because typically the second generation will be attending American schools?
There you go.
And then you get that constant, you're special, you're unique.
You're especially
Because you have all of these rights and protections. And you're taught that.
Great to be American, and then all of a sudden people say is your cousin Osama? Or something like that, yeah.
The other one I was going to add to that, going back to the previous slide about just about the 1%, is so much of it is how you present the information. Because if you said 1% of the population of the Muslim population supports Al Qaeda, and we think, oh, that's very small. If Fox News says 80,000 American Muslims dislike, support Al Qaeda, people would be up in arms. But it's the same number of people,
Right.
basically.
No, and that's exactly what Fox News did when this report was released, yeah.
I was wondering, to add to what you said, what was the response to how the media portrayed it on?
So most of the media was responsible and came out and said very small numbers of Muslim population, like it's basically statistically insignificant, blah, blah, blah. But Fox News did come out and say, and worse, the second generation is more likely to support. So basically there's an Islamic thing that keeps these people from really truly embracing what it means to be American. So it was a bit disconcerting as well. And then the truth is, and this is something that the Muslim American population often complains about, is that Muslim Americans haven't accessed the media the way other groups have. So it's not like you have an ability to counter those claims. Like if you look at Fox News will often bring in the same people trumpeting the same line over and over and over and sell them. And even when they go after the Muslims, they bring in what we call the self-hating Muslims to talk about how bad Islam is, so they had to leave Islam. Seldom do you get Muslims to say, look, this is just not right, and it's not true, and it doesn't reflect what, things that are going on. So that's been what's also a big a source of the grievances about how things are portrayed and playing out in the media.
Can I just ask you about?
Oh, please, sorry.
About the discrimination, and yet at the same time, they may feel discrimination, but it's not affecting them in the workplace. They still don't lose their jobs. So what does that discrimination look like? Is it comments that people are making, or what is the discrimination actually?
So I think in general it's a variety of issues, right? So it's coming from the media. Yeah, being in a supermarket and people might look at you suspiciously. People being in a group and people saying things could be worse. We could be in a Muslim country, right? And so constantly there are references to this this inferior or different, most often scary other. And so that's what people often complain about.
It seems that you work with statistics a lot, so I'm wondering if there's any parallel between the statistic you put up there and then say disaffected, extreme Christians. I'm gonna homeschool my child because the government's gonna indoctrinate them, and I've got an M16 in the background for when they come in there. And is there a parallel that way for the people who are responding like very favorable to Al Qaeda?
So, I mean, I think it's a little bit different there even, because what you're finding is that you have this like youthful, again, like young men who will say, again, when you think about who ISIS is targeting, oh yeah, I support Al Qaeda because they stood up for their rights, or they did this, that, and the other. So like using this discourse of self-empowerment, well, they know nothing about Al Qaeda or like the theology, if you want to even call it that, the dictates that they have. But nevertheless, like this need to assert like this autonomy. And so so that is different. That is more of a deliberate kind of like more organized movement of, we're going to keep our people out of the mainstream. In terms of the Muslim American population in the United States, the Muslim American population is very integrated. They're much more, participate. Most Muslim children about 3% of Muslim children are in Islamic day schools. All Islamic day schools, or at least the majority of Islamic day schools, are accredited in their states, so they're following the curricula that you guys also implement in your schools, plus maybe Arabic or Quran as education. And then most of Muslim students are in the public schools. You don't have a lot of parents who homeschool their children, and primarily that's because a lot of the parents are immigrants and I wouldn't want to take that on.
So the statistic is more reflective of, say, the immigrant experience as opposed to maybe the religious dynamic?
Yeah, this 1%.
Yeah.
The 1 to 5% is it's not really the immigrant experience. It's the second generation experience. It's the second generation. It's the Muslims who were born and raised in the U.S. And it could be African American, it could be Arab, it could be Asian, it could be all of them. And so this is what when we did a little bit more research, we realized that this second generation finding of the second generation being a little bit more radical or extreme, it fits with this reactive ethnicity formation model. It's advanced by Child, Cortez, and Rumbaugh. And what they find is that groups subjected to extreme discrimination and derogation of their national origins are likely to embrace them ever more fiercely. Those received more favorably shift to American identities with greater speed and less pay. It involves embracing the parents' original national identities less as a sign of continuing loyalty to the home country or to the movement or to Al Qaeda than a reaction to hostile conditions in the receiving country. So it's sort of like this idea that what you were saying, that the second generation is told, you are American, you do have equal rights, and they don't get it, so they become very hostile in their reaction. So this is what we think is going on. So looking ahead, Muslims, unfortunately, in my opinion, Muslims are still making little progress in the public relations campaign in this country. If you look at the campaigns, I mean, most recently, again, what's her name, Pamela Geller, instituted this campaign in New York to have the billboards on, not billboards, but the signs on the buses, about like Muslims being terrorists. So again, like you see these organized groups trying to fund and invest into campaigns to demonize Muslims. And so this is a sore point. On the Muslim side, millions and millions of dollars of the community have been poured into trying to counter this through PR means. But again, Muslims are such a small group in this country, they're not going to win the PR battle without other partners. But in all fairness, they've had other partners, right? The ACLU, other minority groups, other religious groups have really embraced the Muslim issues and have worked with them. Even workshops like this where, we've seen a lot of teachers, students say that, when their teachers sort of stand up for them, if they're being bullied or like correct misunderstandings that they found that to be very empowering and representative. So the idea that Muslims still need to assert their rights and move forward. this is my good news point that I was gonna say that we already sort of mentioned, though, that Pew Surveys finds that those in college and more educated have a better view of Muslims, so education does matter. And those who know more about Islam have a better view of Muslims as well. All right, thank you very much. Any other questions? Everybody's ready for a break.